We'll dive right in. Again, my name's Taylor Bradley, and I'm going to talk a bit about my journey here in front of you here today. So I am a dad of two and a husband to, I say, the one for me. I am a former firefighter paramedic prior to getting into HR, though now that I've been in HR, have had about a decade plus experience in it, primarily working in late stage startups in the tech industry across the United States. Hold a master's in management, completing my MBA, currently the global head of HR business partners at Turing. Though either physically or metaphorically, both as a firefighter or paramedic, I've been putting out fires since 2008. And I would just say, if you're joining the call, please make sure you do click mute so we have uninterrupted audio for everyone. But more importantly, what excites me today is, with my background, I'm looking forward to our journey together here today. And all of you are facing unique people analytic challenges. And so what I want to do is talk about how I process data on a level that will be able to be applied to any situation that you all are working through. So our journey today is going to be focusing on processing data like a paramedic or a clinician, give you some practical applications for people analytics at your organization. And then, of course, time permitting, if we have questions, we will try to get to those at the end. I will ask, because everyone has different audio connections here, if you have questions, place them in the chat along the way. And then at the end, we'll look at the chat and answer questions if we have some time. So I want to talk first about how we process data like a paramedic. And what we were taught is something called the MEDICS method. There's 3 points to it, oversimplified a little bit, but assess the situation, determine what the needs are, and then, of course, provide an outcome. So first, let's look at assess the situation. What is the situation that you're presented with? When you're a paramedic, you get called to a whole host of scenes. That could be anything from a bird in someone's house, or a cardiac arrest, or a traffic. We would appreciate if you do remain on mute during this time, but if you do have questions, place those in the chat. So when we get a call as a paramedic, we start to become great observers of any data input that is at our fingertips. We're using all of our senses to gather all of the data that's available to us to have an assessment of what we think is occurring. As we're getting that data in real time, we are actively interpreting that data to come up with what we call is a general impression of what we feel is happening in the situation, or in data terms, we're coming up with a hypothesis that needs to be tested. Now, what was unique is, as I would process data, this is what the inside of my head would look like. There'd be a million different bubbles. And as I would get more data and interpret the data, some bubbles would get larger. Oh, maybe this is a broken bone. Maybe this is a cardiac issue. But as I would get more data, some bubbles would go away, some would get larger, and then I'd come up with, again, what I feel is occurring in the situation based on the data. We would call this a differential diagnosis. What are all of the things that are most likely occurring in that situation? Now, based on this, I would start to determine what are the needs. And in this case, when you're a medic, you need to make decisions. You need to really figure out what's happening, because if you have delays in decision-making or high-quality decision-making, that not just costs minutes, it costs lives. So as we're going through that assessment of the situation and determining what the needs are, we start to explore the data or double-click on the data to get a more in-depth view of what's occurring in this situation. And based on my general impression from assessing the situation, I'm looking for more data to start testing my hypothesis of what I think could be happening in the situation, so I can come up with the needs. One important thing that occurs not only in the medical field, but in the fields that you all are working in, is something called distracting injuries, or in data terms, it would be an outlier. Outliers can be distracting. And in a paramedic sense, they would teach us in school that there may be some injuries that look severe and may actually be severe, but they are not life threats. So in this example, it can be really common to look at a crush injury on a hand, and that could be really disturbing to see. But the medic that gets distracted by that crush injury on the hand and doesn't notice that the patient's actively choking isn't treating the most important need or prioritizing the most important need. And so as we're getting that data and assessing all the things that could be wrong, we start to then have to triage the data to determine what's going to be the most important next step. So my captain, when she was training me, and when we get into this point in the assessment, determining the needs, she told me, sorry, it was need to add a mute there for us. She would tell us to learn how to kiss. Now, looks like I got. Can you all hear me now? Great. All right. So one of the things that our captain would tell us is to learn how to kiss. Now, it may not be what you expect. When she was saying that, it was keep it simple. And as we were determining what the needs are, that always stuck in my head. Now, she always told me, keep it simple, stupid. But for the sake of all you, I won't put you through that. We'll just keep it simple. Now, when you graduate paramedic school, this is what you feel like. You have all of these advanced, shiny tools, this advanced knowledge. You feel like a superhero. But after a year on the job, you realize some of the most effective outcomes are the simplest ones. Simply loading the patient into the ambulance, providing some effective care until you get them to definitive care at the hospital. So the load and go is the terminology that we would use to get them to, let's say, a surgeon or a psychiatric doctor, something along those lines. So there is that differential there, but it's also important that some of the most effective outcomes that you can provide is by keeping it simple. So that brings us to one of the most important parts. You have to provide an outcome. The unique part about first responders is no matter what we get called to, what kind of incident, accident, whatever it is, we can't leave until there's some kind of definitive care outcome provided. And so in this case, we have to leverage all of the training that we've had, all of the experience, all the data available to us to determine what is the most appropriate outcome. And just like people analytics, we also have to monitor trends. We can't rely on one simple data point alone. That's not a really great way to test an hypothesis, and it's certainly not a great way to provide a really high quality outcome. Now, outcomes, as I mentioned before, can vary. It may be something as simple as providing comfort to someone, hearing them out to better understand what they're going through. Sometimes it's CPR, and more often than not, it's transferring someone to definitive care or escalating the care they need to provide a definitive outcome. So one of the unique parts about this is when you get to the hospital, you have to provide a report on the patient. And in the same way you frame data, you have to frame the case to the staff. Now, this is how I felt the first time that I went and had to do a report in the emergency room or for our international colleagues, A&E, is I arrived and it felt like every single person in the emergency room turned around to hear me give report. And that's about how tall I felt going through that experience. It's a little bit terrifying, but we also have to do this in business. The issue with framing data is if you frame data incorrectly, you may not get the best outcome that you're trying to achieve, either for the patient or for your business. And so when I would arrive in the emergency room and got over my fear of providing reports, some of the things that I had to be consistent with was first be rationally bounded. We're humans. There's only so much data that we can process. There's a field of it, heuristics, things of that nature that we have to be mindful of. But we need to be confident and objective and what case we are framing, either in the emergency room to the nurse and the doctor, or in the boardroom. Along with that, it was really important for us to not dramatize or amplify the issue at hand, but to be objective and, most importantly, be concise. Now, this was my journey as a paramedic and how I processed data every single time that I went out on a call. But how does this apply to HR? So first, a recap of the MEDICS method again. We assess the situation, we determine what the needs are, and provide an outcome. But so much of what I've learned in the medical field, either going to fires or to accident scenes, has also been applied to my career in HR and what I do with people analytics and leading people teams. So first thing I want to talk about is scaling. First, one of the most important things about the MEDICS method is that it scales. The idea with the MEDICS method of assess, determine needs, provide an outcome is not that we have to memorize every single response to any variable case that we come out to. Instead, we rely on that tool that scales across anything that we come across. So it's not about memorizing everything. It's about using a consistent tool to approach every case in a methodical way that ideally leads to a positive outcome. So the first part about that in business that I've learned is what made me effective with caring with patients is that I had a high level of data fluency in the data that I needed to be aware of. So in your businesses today and your organizations, identifying the baseline of data fluency within your organization and developing a roadmap of how to raise that bar over time. And that may be through learning and development programs, it could be through micro learnings. There's a whole host of ways for you to raise that data fluency. But I ask all of you, do your leaders know how to differentiate data that is standard and expected and unusual and unexpected? If they don't, and the data fluency is too low, that standardized bar across the organization, you end up with a case like this, where no matter how important your message is, if your audience doesn't understand it, it doesn't matter. And so in this case, if the data fluency is low, you're getting one part of your message across, save lives. Well, gosh, it would be really important to know what saves lives in this case. That's the data fluency bar that you need to raise in your organization. And as you raise that data fluency, you will end up making the message clearer to those in your organization. Next up is analysis paralysis. I am fairly confident that all of us have seen some measure of this. The nice part about in most of our jobs now, including mine, is that analysis paralysis may not cost lives. But what it does cost in organizations is capital, it costs morale, and those are certainly the lifeblood of your organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. And that's where probabilities come into play. It's not that you need to go into an advanced statistics course to understand probabilities or to get your leaders to understand them at a granular level. Instead, just the concept of being comfortable with identifying probable outcomes and their known risk. The amount of time you're spending on a certain decision in your business, is the risk significant in the probability that that risk would be realized, or is the outcome, the probable outcome, one that can't be undone? And in most of the time in HR, quick decision-making can lead to high quality outcomes. And if they don't, can often be undone quickly. So instead, if you are going to spend any time evaluating a particular issue that you're facing in your organization, make sure it's one that needs to have time and extra analysis before making the call. Because more often than not, we can just make calls quickly. And so this is what I ask you to go back to your organizations on, identify if there is analysis paralysis and people are taking too long to make decisions. Get an understanding of why. Sometimes that could be simply a fear-based reason they're not doing it, a lack of reward, could be micromanagement, but really get at the underlying issue there. The next up is it's their emergency and not yours. When you're a paramedic, this is something that's taught to you and drilled into your head at a very early stage in your career. We're not actors, we're medical professionals. And so when we arrive on scene, we're trained to solve problems, not create more of it. The problem is on a human level, when you panic, the higher cognitive function in your brain tends to shut down or not be as active. And so you actually go into fight or flight mode in your body, and stress can cause this as well. And you may not be able to operate at the top of your game. So we're given a lot of tools to make sure that we don't run across that. And we always remember it's the patient's emergency and not ours. It's our problem to solve and provide an outcome to, but we shouldn't add to the drama. We shouldn't amplify any of the issues. Instead, focus on assess, determine needs, and provide the outcome. You can do this in your business. If you show up to a meeting, remain calm, remain objective, no matter what you're coming across. So I ask you this question. Which paramedic would you prefer to care for one of your loved ones? I'm sure we all had a pretty immediate reaction to this. There's generally one of these people you don't want to be when you go into the boardroom and present, or you go to present your data. If I were to show up on a scene, pulling my hair and panicking and having, I don't know, like half a sunburn on my face, that's not an ideal situation. Instead, you want to be like our other clinician here, professional, calm, steady hand when you approach any type of case with your data. So finally here, one of the most important and exciting parts about data is an opportunity to tell a story. If you recall back when I would arrive in the emergency room or A&E to give report on my patient, I had to connect the data that I was presented with of the case with the analysis that I have had to then tell the story. When you're doing this in people analytics, oftentimes what I've seen in HR teams is they rely solely on the data. They pass forward raw data without analysis, leaving our leaders to draw their own conclusions without any expert opinion. And so it's critical that we have the right data and the right analysis to tell the most important story of all. And those are the cases that you're dealing with. One case comes to mind when I was a paramedic, where there was a data point and then there was analysis. I got a call to an individual's house that had passed out, seemingly for low blood sugar. When we found them unconscious or semi-conscious in their bedroom, we took a blood glucose and their blood sugar was low. We gave them the medicine they needed to get back on their feet and get well. But as I was walking past the kitchen, I noticed this scene. There were 3 huge bags of sugar and orange juice and a spilled drink on the floor. And so I asked the patient, what's going on here? This is pretty unusual to have this amount of stuff. Did you pass out on the floor? And we learned from the patient that beyond the data of the low blood sugar was the story. The patient knew they had sugar problems. They weren't entirely sure what diabetes was or anything like that. And so when they would feel unwell and they would feel like they're going to pass out, they would get a big heap of sugar, put it into orange juice, mix it, and then drink it to try to feel better. The reason for that, the story for that, was because the patient couldn't afford to go to a doctor, or what they felt they couldn't afford. And so for us as paramedics, the outcome wasn't simply raising their blood sugar. It was getting them connected with social workers to be able to get this individual the health care they needed so they didn't have to rely on self-treatment. But if we were to myopically just be stuck on low blood sugar, we made their blood sugar higher in the story and didn't try to connect all of the dots and generate the analysis to understand the story better, we would not have provided the right outcome. You can apply this to any aspect of your business. So finally, we recap here. The applications to HR for the Medics method are scaling your data, mitigating analysis paralysis. It's their emergency and not yours. That steady hand approach to leadership and people analytics, and tell the story, ideally the right story. To close here today, I want to always end all of my talks with a commitment that I made to my grandfather before he passed away. He made me promise to never stop learning and to never stop helping people. So I pass this along to you. I always like to share the resources that I have found very helpful recently. These are some great book recommendations that I have for you. And I am highly recommend getting familiar with ChatGPT or Bard or any kind of other generative AI tool. Can be exceptionally helpful in people analytics, not only to teach you it, but to run it, ideas past it and get some other ideas of how you can apply people analytics in your business. You're also welcome to connect with me on my website, taylorfromhr.com or LinkedIn. And finally, never stop helping people. When I was a paramedic, one thing I wish all non-clinicians knew is that there's some simple skills that if you spent 5 or 10 minutes on YouTube learning, such as just CPR until medics arrive, the Heimlich maneuver, how to attach an AED, you too could save a life one day. And so take a few minutes, look this stuff up on YouTube, always call for professional medical help, but certainly do your part as a citizen as well.